Hello everyone and welcome back to Tech with NK. In today's video, I'm going to propose a solution to the exercise Lines of Code from CS50's Introduction to Programming with Python. I'm going to show you how I went ahead to solve this exercise. However, I just wish to provide you with a few ideas or hints that you could use to solve the exercise later on by yourself. So that said, let's look at the exercise and see what's expected for us. I encourage you to stay tuned to the end of the video because I'm going to do a lot of explanation while writing the code. So that said, I'm going to start by skipping all of this. It's not so important, and I'm going to come to this line or to this sentence. It says, in a file called lines.py, implement a program that expects one command line argument, that's the name or a path to a Python file, and outputs the number of lines of code in that file, excluding comments and blank spaces. That's, for example, if you look at this file, if you run it on this file, it should output 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and on this file it should output 2. Coming back here, and it says if the user does not specify exactly one command line argument, or if the specified file does not end with a .py, or if the specified file does not exist, the program should instead exit via a sys.exit message. And also, we're expected to assume that any line that starts with a hashtag, optionally preceded by a white space or not, is a comment, and a docstring should not be considered a comment. We're going to look at what a docstring is later on if you do not know what it is. And finally, assume that any line that only contains white spaces is blank. We've been given a number of useful hints. The first is to use the string methods lstrip and start with. And also, we've been told that open can raise a file not found error. That's if we're trying to open a file that does not exist. And we should try to test our program with a few examples from the course code or with our own examples. So if we look at the demo, what do we have here? So the first time that this file is being run, that's Python of lines.py, we see that no command line argument was passed with it, and so the output is too few command line arguments. This time around, a command line argument was passed in, FOO, but this is not a Python file. So the file exited with a message, not a Python file. In this other case, foo and bar, that's altogether 3 command line arguments, which is also wrong. And so the file exited with too many command line arguments. In this case, we have Python of lines.py, foo.py. So this is a Python file. However, this file does not exist. And so the output should be file does not exist. And this time around, when you run with an existing Python file, we have the output too. And as usual, we are expected to create a dictionary or a directory if you prefer, call it lines, cd to that directory and create the Python file lines.py. And we are expected to test our code, checking that our code is able to output all the expected outputs, that's too few command line arguments, too many, and all the rest appropriately. So that said, I want to believe the exercise is clear enough, and I'm just going to open up VS Code and we're going to write the code together. So as you notice, I have already created a Python file lines.py, and while I was at it, I created a number of files too, test.py, test1.py, and these other files, along with this Jupyter notebook to help better explain the exercise and test the code like I promised in the beginning of the video. So coming back to our file lines.py, the first thing we need to do in this file is to import sys. This is because, as we remember, according to the exercise, we are supposed to run our file lines.py with command line arguments. And for us to be able to check these command line arguments, we need to use the module sys. And by now, I'm sure you already know that the total number of command line arguments sys is expecting is equal to 2. That's because the first argument will be the name of our file, that's lines.py, and the second argument will be the file from which we are trying to read the number of lines present. So having that in mind, I'm going to write a bunch of if statements to check the number of command line arguments the user passed while running the code. So I'll start by saying if the length, that's for the length of sys.argv is equal to 1, that's if the user forgot to pass the second argument, I want to sys.exit with the message too few command line arguments. Too few command line arguments. Or copy and paste this And this time around, I want to check if sys.argv is greater than 2. That's if the user passed in more than 2 command line arguments. I want to return too many command line arguments. And if the user does actually enter exactly 2 arguments, I'm going to write another if statement to check that the second argument the user passes is a Python file. So to do this, I'm going to say if sys.argv at position 1, that's for the second parameter, dot ends with a .py, and this should return true if the user passes a file which is actually a Python file. But for this case, I want to catch files, or I want to catch user inputs that are not Python files. So I'm going to use the not keyword here to negate the result of this check, meaning this will actually result to true when the user's input is not a Python file. I'm going to put my colon here, and if this results to be true, I want to sys.exit with the message not a Python file. Oh, Python. So with these if statements, I should be able to check if the user enters too many arguments or too few arguments, and if the user's input is actually a Python file. Now, if the user's input is a Python file, the next check we need to carry out is if that file does exist. And if you remember from the hints that were given to us, we're told that if we use open to try to open a file that does not exist, it's going to return a file not found error. So I'm going to try to open the file or the input that the user is going to pass to this code, and I'm going to put this in a try block, catching any file not found errors with the except block. And this will look like try with open, and what am I trying to open? sys.argv at position 1 in read mode. I could put this R as well as I could leave it out as file. And all I want to do is to read the content of this file in a variable I'm going to call lines using the readLines method. ReadLines, parenthesis. So this block of code should be able to open the file the user is going to pass as an input, and then read all the contents of that file and pass it to the variable lines. And if this fails, I want to catch that with an except block, catching the except file not found error. And I'll return the message sys.exit file does not exist. So this should do to catch any errors that could result from this program. That's if the user enters too few arguments, too many arguments, an argument that's not a Python file, and an argument that's actually a Python file but which does not exist. But now, if there is no error and so the user entered a file that actually exists, I'm going to continue the rest of my code in an else block, which is a block of code that's going to run only when the try block runs successfully. The first thing I'm going to do is I'll create a variable or call it num lines, and I'll set it equal to 0 because I want to use this variable to save the number of lines found in the file. And all I need to do now is to iterate over the variable lines, which is actually a list, checking each index and counting the number of lines which are not white spaces or comments. But the question in our minds now should be, how do we identify the white spaces and comments? I'm going to use a sample file I already created and a Jupyter notebook to give you an idea of how to do this. So if you look at this file test.py, this is a very simple file I just copied from the website online and modified it a little. In this first line we have a comment, say hello. In the second line we have a white space, that's an empty space. In this third line we have a docstring, so this is a docstring. In this fourth line an empty space as well. In the fifth line and in the sixth line we have a number of statements, and the seventh line is empty as well. And in this notebook I've already written a few lines of code here, but that's fine, there's not really much to it. I started by opening the file test.py using open, so with open test.py as file, lines equals to file.readLines, and I saved all the lines of test.py in the variable lines, just like I did in a file lines.py over here. So coming back to this, and here you remember that if we're just reading from a file, we can call open like this without explicitly putting it in read mode, because by default it's going to be in read mode. And to make you see the contents of the variable lines, I went ahead to print lines. So if you look at this is a list. with the contents say hello or \n. This is a docstring, another \n, this, and this. And these corresponds to the lines of code found in test.py. So if I separate my VS Code into two windows and I open this file test.py this way, you're going to see that when we look at the output of our variable lines, say hello, this is our first line, and this \n corresponds to our second line of code here. And you see that this is actually an empty line or an empty space. So this tells us that an empty line is basically a \n. This docstring, this is this line, and you notice that each line has a \n at the end of it. If I keep going, this \n corresponds to the fourth line of code here. After the third line, this is a docstring. So what I want us to note here is that lines is a list like any other list, and we can iterate over it. And the elements of this list corresponds to each line of code found in our file test.py. Each element ends with a \n and starts just like the way it's in the file. Like you see, this first element starts with a hashtag, and empty spaces are just \ns. So having this in mind, I'm going to close this. I'll come back to my file lines.py, and to continue here, I'm going to start a for loop for line in lines. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to strip every line. That's to remove any white spaces. That white spaces could be tabs, could be \n, that's new lines. So to remove any white spaces in every line of code, I'm going to create a new variable, and I'm going to call it stripped_lines. And in this variable, I'm going to save line.strip. Then I'm going to perform a check to see if a line either starts with a hashtag using the method starts with, that's a string method, or if a line is an empty space. And this will look like if stripped lines is equal to an empty string, stripped lines dot starts with a hashtag. What do I want to do? I want to continue. And the keyword continue here should push our code to go back to the top of the loop and keep iterating over every element of our variable lines. However, if this check results to be false, all I want to do is increment the value of num lines. So num lines plus equal to 1. And at the end of the for loop, I want to print the value of num lines. And with this, we've completed our file lines.py. So I'm going to save this or open up my terminal, and we're going to test the code together. First check Python of lines.py, and as we expected, too few command line arguments. If I run this again, Python of lines.py, let's say dog cat, too many command line arguments. So far this looks good. If I run this again and let's say dog.py, py does not exist, which is true because we do not have any file dog.py. And if I run this again, checking the last error type, not a Python file, and this is true because doc is not a Python file, it does not have the extension .py. So now that we've checked all the ways the user could run this wrongly, let's run this on some files that actually exist and see if our code is able to do well. So I went ahead and created a number of test files in these same directory lines, test1.py, test2.py, test3.py. If I open this, you see that test1.py is just comments and empty spaces. Test2.py will have a few lines of code with a comment at the end. Test3.py and test4.py. And this one is a little bit longer with a docstring and all of this. I'm going to run this first of all on test1.py, and we should expect an output of 0. So if I come back to my terminal, and instead of putting doc here, let's say test1.py, and our output 0. So that is good. Let's do this again, and this time around, let's say test2.py. If I run this, output of 4. If I open our file test2.py, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's just right. The rest of this is just comments and empty spaces. Let's try this again. Let's see, test3 is quite long, but well, I think we can do test3. So if I run this, let me remove 2 here and say 3, and so we have 10 lines in test3. Let's check that out. This is a comment. So let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And so this is accurate. We do have 10 lines of code. Here, line 2 and line 4 are just codes, but then they still count as lines. The only things that don't count as lines of code are comments and empty spaces. And for our final check, let's run these on test4.py. So let me remove these and say 4.py. I will have 4 lines of code. If I open this, 1, 2, 3, 4. And so as we can all see, our file lines.py is working just well and is able to do just what we need it to do. And with this, I think we can end the video here. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below and I'll be more than pleased to answer you. If you enjoyed the video, do well to hit the like and subscribe buttons so as to support the channel. For this video, I'm going to share a link to these files, test.py, test1, test2, test3, and test4. In case you want to use them to do the testing of your own code, I'll be glad to help you out with these. So that said, have a good day.